September 1968, North Vietnam. Up there, the sky has a texture only pilots know. Thin, sharp, unforgiving, like it's made of glass dust. Inside the MiG-21, the air is colder than it should be, stale with oxygen mask rubber and the faint bite of electrical heat. The canopy is a small world of curved plexiglass, gauges, and trust. He trusts the numbers. He's earned that trust. For years, his side has treated this little delta-winged fighter like a knife in a phone booth. Tight, brutal, certain. The Americans bring big jets with big engines and big promises. They bring missiles that don't always behave. They bring a doctrine that says, distance will save you. But distance is a luxury the sky doesn't always grant. Two F-4 Phantoms slide into view below him, dark shapes against the haze, like heavy animals in water. He tips the nose down and feels gravity give him speed. The MiG answers quickly. It's not elegant, it's eager. A compact thing built to sprint, to climb, to intercept. He expects the old pattern. American pilots see the merge coming and run. They light afterburners and stretch the fight until a missile can settle the argument. Speed is their religion. This time, they don't run. The first Phantom brakes hard and climbs into the vertical, pulling the sky down over its own nose. It's an aggressive move, an American move in shape, but not in timing. Not in the way it uses the MiG's appetite for the turn. He tightens the circle anyway, because that's what the MiG does best. It grabs the air and refuses to let go. He waits for the Phantom's wings to begin pleading, for the heavy machine to bleed energy and stumble. The stumble never comes. Instead, the Phantom carves a vertical rolling pattern with a precision that feels intimate, like a hand turning the exact page of a book, like someone who already knows where the sentence ends. A warning prickles at the base of his skull. Not fear, something worse. Confusion with teeth. The Phantom slips into a position that shouldn't be easy. Not at this altitude, not with this geometry. And the American doesn't just appear behind him. He appears behind him at the moment the MiG can least afford it, as if he's reading the MiG's limits off the pilot's own fingertips. He shoves the throttle forward. Afterburner kicks like a mule, a sudden shove of heat and thrust. The MiG leaps upward, trying to trade speed for altitude, trying to escape by climbing into the thin air where it's supposed to be king. The Phantom matches the climb as if it was waiting for it. Now, the second Phantom appears, already placed, already patient, sitting in the one wedge of sky the MiG's cockpit can't easily check without losing precious energy. It's not a lucky guess, it's geometry. A missile leaves the rail, a bright streak, a violent flash that erases every plan he had. And for a moment, the world becomes pure motion. No horizon, no up or down, only the blunt truth that someone on the other side is no longer fighting the MiG-21 as a mystery. They're fighting it as a known quantity. Hours later, on the ground, the air in the briefing room is warm and dirty with cigarette smoke. Maps and plots cover the table like skin laid out for inspection. Men from Moscow stand over the paper with the quiet authority of people sent to certify superiority. They have been living on comforting ratios, on propaganda-friendly numbers that say, our jets are cheaper, our pilots are tougher, our design is right. Then a senior advisor traces the Phantom's track with a grease pencil and stops halfway through the loop. He doesn't have to speak loudly. The room leans toward the silence, because the line on the paper isn't just a line, it's a confession. The Phantom flew the edge of the envelope like it belonged there, pushed hard enough to hurt the MiG without overcommitting into a stall. It didn't waste energy, it didn't flail, it didn't guess. It behaved like someone who had practiced against this exact aircraft. A junior officer waves it off. Luck, cowboy flying. Americans are reckless. The advisor doesn't look up. He taps the point where the Phantom reversed at exactly the moment the MiG would begin to lose its bite. Once is luck, he says, almost to the paper. A pattern is something else. He doesn't say the words everyone is trying not to think. If the enemy knows the MiG's true limits, its acceleration curve, its visibility, the way it behaves when pushed into the wrong corner of the sky, then the MiG isn't just threatened, it's compromised. And that implies something catastrophic, a breach big enough to swallow an entire doctrine. Back in Moscow, the Great Design Bureau sleeps under the illusion that secrecy is armor. Behind those walls are men who drew this machine into existence with rulers and arguments and pride. They know every shortcut, every compromise, every decision made to save weight, to simplify production, to make the jet something a conscript mechanic can keep alive on a rough field in a war that might last 20 days. Their confidence has a simple foundation. The Americans don't get to touch it. The Americans don't get to sit inside it. The Americans don't get to learn the feel of it, the way the stick loads up in a hard turn, the way the engine note changes when you're squeezing the last honest thrust out of it. That knowledge is supposed to be locked behind borders and loyalties. Yet the reports from Vietnam have begun to sound like someone is unlocking the door from the outside. Across the ocean, in offices where paranoia is a professional skill, the Americans are living a different story. In the late 1960s, their Navy is paying in pilots and aluminum for a doctrine built on certainty. Missiles promised clean kills at distance. Real combat, rules of engagement, cluttered skies, fleeting opportunities, turns those promises into frustration. Their most expensive jets are sometimes dragged into the kind of close-range fight they were never trained to love. They don't need a miracle. They need an advantage that fits inside the human brain. And somewhere between those needs, Soviet secrecy and American desperation, an audacious idea takes shape. Don't study the MiG from photographs. Steal one. 2 years earlier, August 1966, Iraq. A MiG-21 sits on a runway under a hard sun that feels close enough to touch. The aircraft looks small and sharp, a dart made real. The pilot climbing into it carries something more dangerous than a weapon, a decision. His name will be written differently in different files, in different languages, by different hands that want him to be either hero or traitor. To the Soviets, he is a trusted custodian of their technology. To their enemies, he is a door. He takes off on what should be routine. The moment the wheels leave the ground, his life becomes a countdown. He breaks from formation. He turns away from the airspace that owns him. Every second of his flight is a gamble against radar and reaction time. He crosses borders not with paperwork, but with speed. And when he finally lowers the landing gear, it isn't onto friendly concrete. It is into Israel. The plane rolls to a stop. The engine winds down. And for the first time, the myth is no longer a myth. It is a physical object. Hot metal, fuel smell, rivets, worn paint, and a cockpit that looks like it was built to survive rough hands. Israel does what small nations must do when they've been handed a large secret. They measure its weight and decide how to spend it. Because the MiG isn't just an airplane. It's leverage. Then, under the kind of quiet agreements that never reach newspapers, the secret moves again. January 1968, Nevada. There's a place in the desert that doesn't like being named. A dry lakebed surrounded by restricted airspace and routine lies. On maps, it's either blank or harmless. In reality, it's a door with guards. A transport aircraft lands at night and rolls toward a distant hangar, away from the more famous silhouettes on the base. The high-altitude spies, the experimental shapes, the projects that collect rumors like dust. The ramp lowers, and something wrapped in canvas appears like a body on a gurney. When the coverings come off, the first reaction in the hangar is not awe, it's disbelief. American engineers are used to machines that look expensive because they are. Flush panels, clean lines, a finish that suggests pride. The MiG-21 in front of them looks like it was built with a different definition of pride. The skin is rougher than expected. The workmanship is not delicate. It's practical. The cockpit is painted an unsettling turquoise that makes the jet feel less like a weapon and more like a creature with its own internal organs. Someone mutters a joke, a tube with wings, a farm-built rocket. And then a test pilot walks around the aircraft and stops smiling, because the pilot doesn't care about flush rivets. He cares about what is hard to see. He notices how small the aircraft is from the front. He imagines it against a hazy sky at 5 miles, how it would vanish. He notices the blunt intake, the tight wing, the way everything unnecessary has been cut away until the jet is mostly engine, fuel, and intent. He sees it not as crude, but as stripped. A weapon built by people who expect to lose planes and still win wars. Now comes the problem nobody can romanticize. How do you fly a secret written in a language you don't speak? The cockpit is a forest of Cyrillic. The gauges are metric. The red lines mean danger. But the exact kind of danger, how much, how soon, how irreversible, has to be relearned the hard way. You can't just translate words. You have to translate habits. So they tape English labels over Soviet ones. They mark the dials. They draw conversions. They build checklists from inference and caution. And in doing so, they create a new symbol without realizing it. They are literally covering the enemy's language with their own. When the ground crew connects external power, the hangar holds its breath. There is a moment where silence feels like pressure in the ears. Then the engine catches with a harsh, unfamiliar voice, less polished, more guttural. The jet exhales the smell of foreign fuel and hot fluid, sharp and wrong, like the machine has brought its homeland with it in invisible fumes. The engineers watch the instruments. The pilots listen to the sound. In the noise is a warning and a promise. The MiG is alive. Now comes the next question. Not, can it fly, but what does it teach? Because a captured aircraft is not a trophy. It's a textbook. And textbooks are only lethal when someone is willing to learn every ugly paragraph, including the parts that end with funerals. The pilots chosen for this work understand what they're being asked to do. They're being asked to climb into the enemy's confidence, to find the edge of its stability, to map the places it can't see, to take the mystery, the one thing the Soviet design depended on, and tear it apart into diagrams, timings, and habits that can be drilled into young men before they ever see Vietnam. On the far side of the world, Soviet advisors in Hanoi stare at radar plots and feel a cold thought taking root. The Americans are not winning by chance. They are winning by familiarity. And familiarity, in war, is a stolen thing. Back at Groom Lake, the MiG-21 sits at the end of the runway like a dare. The morning desert air shimmers over the salt flat. Heat is already building even though the day is young. The crew chief's hands move with professional calm, but his eyes keep flicking to the exhaust and the control surfaces as if expecting the aircraft to object to being handled by strangers. A test pilot climbs the ladder and settles into the turquoise cockpit. The canopy comes down, sealing him inside a world of alien markings and borrowed certainty. His gloved hand wraps the stick. It feels simple, direct, honest. On the radio, the tower clears him to taxi. The MiG rolls forward, and everyone watching knows the difference between studying an enemy and becoming it, even for a moment. Because once the afterburner lights, this stops being an intelligence coup. It becomes a live experiment with a margin for error measured in heartbeats. And the first time that Soviet engine is pushed into full fury in American hands, one question hangs in the desert air like a fuse burning down. Will it behave, or will it punish them for touching it? The MiG-21 rolls. At first, it's just tires on concrete, soft, almost polite. Then the engine note rises and the sound hardens, becoming a pressure in the chest more than a noise in the ears. The jet is small enough that it doesn't look like it should make the air vibrate like this. It looks like a dart, a toy, a mistake. Then it starts to accelerate, and nobody is laughing anymore. The afterburner lights with a sudden brutal bloom, white heat, a throat of flame, a punch that turns the runway into a blur. The jet surges forward as if it has been insulted by gravity and intends to answer. The test pilot keeps it straight with small corrections. The controls feel different, lighter, less filtered. The aircraft talks to him through the stick in a direct language. You pull, I pull, you push, I push. No softness, no apology. At rotation speed, he lifts the nose, and the MiG leaves the Earth cleanly, like it has been waiting years for permission. In the first minutes, they do not do anything dramatic. No steep turns, no heroics. They fly it like a live grenade with the pin already half out. They check the systems. They watch temperatures. They listen for the wrong sound. But even in this cautious dance, the truth begins to show itself. The MiG climbs fast. It doesn't climb like a refined machine. It climbs like a stripped animal. It accelerates through the mid-range with a hunger that surprises men who have spent careers trusting American thrust and American weight. The MiG has less of both. Less weight, less airplane. So every pound of thrust means more. On the ground, the engineers stare at their own assumptions, suddenly embarrassed by them. They had expected crew to mean weak. They are learning something that will become a theme of the next decade. Crude can mean deliberate. Simple can mean optimized for a world where you expect to be hit. When the MiG comes back in and taxis to a stop, the engine winding down into a metallic sigh, the pilot climbs out with sweat on his neck and a look he can't quite disguise. It's the look of a man who has just met the enemy and realized the enemy is not stupid. It's also the look of a man who now understands something else. If you can fly the MiG, you can stop fearing it. And fear, in air combat, is a tax that compounds. They don't waste time. At Groom Lake, time is not measured in calendars. It's measured in how quickly information can be turned into advantage. They start flying profiles. They map climb rates, acceleration, turn performance. They push the jet to corners of its envelope that a cautious operator might avoid. They do what peacetime engineers do when they are given a wartime object. They try to break it without breaking themselves. They discover the MiG's genius in the same breath they discover its limits. It's fast to get to the fight, but it doesn't stay there long. The fuel disappears when you ask for afterburner. It's a fighter built to sprint from a nearby strip, slap an intruder out of the sky, and return before the clock catches up. That makes perfect sense if your war is being fought over your own territory. It makes less sense if you're thousands of miles from home and trying to patrol. The MiG is also unforgiving in the wrong hands. It will do what it's told right up until the moment it stops doing anything at all. Pull too hard at low speed, and the aircraft can depart controlled flight, flipping into a sickening, falling, leaf-like motion that turns the cockpit into a washing machine. And then there's the thing that becomes the gold nugget, the cruelly simple discovery that turns into doctrine. The cockpit cannot see everything. There is a thick spine behind the pilot's head, structure and armor and design compromise, a metal ridge that blocks the view straight aft. In a dogfight, that blind wedge of sky is not a small detail. It's a graveyard waiting to be filled. The test pilot reports it without drama. 6 o'clock is not good. Not good? An analyst asks, pen hovering. The pilot shrugs like a man describing weather. 6 o'clock is blind. It doesn't sound like much until you imagine a phantom tucked into that cone. Until you imagine a MiG pilot banking, just a little, to check behind. And that bank bleeding just enough energy to lose the fight. That single wedge of sky becomes a shape on a whiteboard, a cone drawn with a ruler, a kill box that can be taught, repeated, practiced until it becomes instinct. An instinct is faster than fear, but there is still a gap between knowing and using, a dangerous, frustrating gap, because the U.S. doesn't just need a file marked top secret sitting in a safe in Nevada. It needs young pilots over Vietnam to carry this knowledge in their muscles. It needs the information to become reflex. And reflex doesn't come from reading. Reflex comes from humiliation. That is when fate hands them a second key. August 1968. The Mediterranean sunlight is bright enough to feel like a glare inside your skull. 2 Syrian pilots in MiG-17s, older jets, slower jets, get lost. The story, depending on who tells it, is either tragic incompetence or the kind of small human error that has changed history more than once. They think they are landing somewhere else. They touch down in Israel, and suddenly Israel has something that shouldn't be there, a relic that still kills. The MiG-17 is subsonic. It looks like yesterday's technology next to the sleek threats of the late 1960s. But in Vietnam, yesterday can still murder tomorrow, because a slow-turning fight is not a contest of speed. It's a contest of geometry and brutality. The MiG-17 turns fast. It turns inside expensive jets that were built to run and shoot and leave, not to knife fight at low speed. It turns so sharply that an American pilot can feel the insult in the air. When word reaches Washington, the reaction is not surprise. It's hunger. Within weeks, the second set of aircraft is quietly dismantled and moved piece by piece across oceans and politics, to the same desert runway where the MiG-21 already sits like a stolen crown. Now, Groom Lake has something like a curriculum, a high-threat teacher and a low-threat teacher, a supersonic dart and a slow-turning scalpel. And if you're trying to write the enemy's playbook, you need both chapters. Inside the hangars, the work becomes almost absurdly detailed. The cockpits are still labeled in Cyrillic. The gauges still speak in kilometers per hour and meters. American pilots are trained in knots and feet, in habits so baked into the body that even the best men can die from a single wrong glance. So they do something that is both mundane and profound. They tape labels over the foreign words. They mark the danger lines. They translate not just the language, but the rhythm of operating the machine. They build checklists by reverse engineering the logic of Soviet design. What has to happen first? What can happen later? What cannot be rushed? Every piece of tape is a tiny act of conquest, because every label is a sentence that says, "This is ours now." The engineers find surprises too. They open panels expecting futuristic trickery and find systems that look almost aggressively straightforward, mechanical linkages, rugged components, parts that are easier to replace than to admire. They realize the Soviets built these planes the way a nation at war builds rifles, something you can manufacture fast, maintain with basic tools, and accept losing as long as the loss buys time. A phrase begins to form in the minds of men who think in budgets, disposable, not in contempt, in clarity. The MiG is not designed for a 20-year service life. It is designed for a short, violent sprint through history. And that design philosophy has consequences. It shapes everything: fuel, maintenance, cockpit visibility, reliability under abuse. Those consequences become lessons. Then comes the part that feels like a mirror held too close to the face. On a workbench, intelligence officers and technicians take apart the captured air-to-air missile systems. They expect the usual Cold War sensation: alien ideas, unfamiliar solutions, some clever Soviet trick that will take years to decode. Instead, they find something they recognize: a shape, a seeker logic, a design lineage that makes a few men go quiet, because recognition can be more shocking than novelty. It suggests not just Soviet ingenuity, but Soviet opportunism, the kind that takes what works and copies it, because in war, pride is optional. The room doesn't erupt with laughter. It's not funny. It's valuable, because if the enemy weapon is a cousin of your own, then your own experience becomes a key. Your own countermeasures stop being guesses and start being tailored. Again, the theme repeats. The myth collapses into mechanics. Out in the sky, the tests become brutal. They fly the MiGs against American fighters again and again, recording everything. Where the MiG wins, where it bleeds, how long it can run before it's hungry, how it behaves when pushed past comfort into panic. And the more they learn, the clearer it becomes that the MiG's power was never just its turn rate or its climb. Its power was the way it forced Americans to fight the wrong fight. The Phantom is fast and strong and capable, but it is heavy. In a tight turn, it bleeds energy like a wounded animal bleeds blood. Its early war missile-only confidence becomes a liability when the fight collapses into close-range chaos. It's a fighter that, for too long, has been asked to be a missile truck first and a brawler second. The MiGs punish that. The MiG-17 punishes it with cannons and tight circles. The MiG-21 punishes it with acceleration and a small silhouette that vanishes against the sky like a lie. In debriefs, American pilots say the same things with different words. I couldn't see him. I couldn't shake him. I was inside his fight. Those sentences are the beginning of a revolution because they force an uncomfortable conclusion. The American pilot is not losing because he's less brave or less skilled. He's losing because he's been trained for a war that exists on paper. So, the project leaders at Groom Lake face a decision that turns their intelligence coup into a strategic weapon. They can write a report and lock it away. Or they can build a school, because pilots don't change in libraries. They change in the air, when their stomach drops and their pride breaks, and they survive long enough to learn from it. The first time someone says it out loud, really says it with the weight of commitment, the hangar seems to get quieter. We need to let them fight it, an officer says, voice low. Let who fight it? Someone asks, already knowing. Everyone who's going to Vietnam. Everyone who's going to face this. That is where secrecy and necessity collide. Because once you turn this into training, the secret can't stay small. It has to spread. It has to become institutional, and institutions leak. But the alternative is worse. Keep the secret locked away and keep burying pilots. In a windowless room, a plan begins to take shape. Exclusive, dangerous, and unofficial in the way the most important things often are. Select instructors. Carefully controlled access. A curriculum built around humiliation and survival. Teach the phantom pilot not to fear the MiG's myth, but to exploit the MiG's habits. Teach him to stay out of the turning trap. Teach him to go vertical. Teach him to live in the blind cone. Teach him to stop thinking of the enemy as a rumor. This is the part of the story that is hardest for the Soviet Union to imagine, because it isn't just theft, it's conversion. They stole the aircraft, yes, but then they did something that feels almost more offensive. They stole the experience of flying it, and they turned that experience into a factory process. A MiG becomes not a secret weapon, but a training aid. Back in Moscow, the design bureau begins to feel a draft under the door. Not proof, not yet. Just a chill that doesn't go away. Reports from allies, murmurs about strange American confidence. A pattern of losses that doesn't fit old explanations. They tighten security. They count airframes. They look for missing jets like men counting teeth with a sore tongue. On paper, nothing is missing. In reality, something immeasurable is gone. Surprise! At Groom Lake, the MiGs keep flying. The data piles up. Charts become doctrine. Doctrine becomes language. Short phrases that fit in a pilot's mouth at high G. Don't turn with it. Don't follow it down. Don't lose sight. Stay in the cone. And then the most consequential decision of all is made. This knowledge will not remain an experiment. It will become a ritual. A select group of pilots is chosen, briefed, sworn to silence. They are told they're going somewhere that doesn't exist, to fight airplanes they aren't supposed to believe are real. They board a transport under a dark sky. The cabin smells of canvas seats and stale coffee and nervous sweat. Men crack jokes that don't land. They check their watches without knowing what they're counting down to. When they arrive, the desert greets them with heat even at dawn, and a horizon that looks too empty to hide anything. But it hides everything. They are driven past fences and signs and guards who don't talk. They are brought to a briefing room where the windows don't open and the walls have heard too much. A projector hums. A map of the world appears, and on it, in a place that should be blank, a dot is drawn. A man at the front of the room doesn't introduce himself with rank or charm. He introduces himself with a fact. "You're here," he says, "because people are dying in a fight they don't understand." He clicks a remote. A grainy silhouette appears on the screen, the sharp delta of the MiG-21, the older curve of the MiG-17. Then he says the sentence that turns the room cold. "You're going to fight them." A few men laugh, uncertain. They think it's metaphor. They think it's adversary training with American jets painted up. The instructor doesn't smile. He advances the slide. A photograph of a MiG on a desert runway. Sun glare. The unmistakable shape of it, not a mock-up, not a drone, not a rumor. The laughter dies in throats. The instructor lets the silence become heavy enough to feel. Not simulations, he says. Not guesses, not stories. He pauses. The real thing. And somewhere outside, beyond the walls and the fences and the lies, an engine starts, foreign, harsh, unmistakable, rising into a note that makes every pilot in the room look up, because the sound doesn't belong in America. It belongs to the enemy, and it's getting closer. The sound grows, not the smooth, familiar whine of American turbines. This is rougher, throatier, like the engine has teeth. It rises and falls outside the briefing room wall, and the men inside sit still, suddenly aware of how strange it is to hear an enemy voice on your own soil. Somebody swallows. Somebody clears his throat and regrets making noise. The instructor doesn't rush to fill the silence. He lets the sound do the work, because if you're going to rewire a pilot's instincts, you start with something the body can't ignore. He clicks again. A simple diagram appears. A cone drawn behind a small delta shape. A blind wedge of sky where the MiG cannot see without paying a price. This, he says, tapping the cone, is where fear goes to die. A few of the pilots stare like they're looking at a magic trick. Others lean forward, hungry. One man in the back frowns, already doing the mental math of 1,000 engagements he's imagined and a dozen he's lived. The instructor keeps his voice flat. You've been taught the enemy is a rumor. You've been taught he's fast and agile, and that you should respect him like a ghost. He pauses, then says the quiet heresy. He's not a ghost. He's a machine. Machines have habits. habits can be exploited. Outside, the engine note changes, throttle movement, a quick spike, then a settling growl. The pilots look at the ceiling again, because the sound is close enough now to feel like it's inside the building. The instructor points to the diagram. This isn't theory. This is a place you can live. If you can keep your jet in that space, the MiG pilot's world collapses into a problem he can't solve without bleeding energy. He has to bank to check behind. When he banks, he slows. When he slows, he loses what he came to the fight with. He doesn't mention courage. He doesn't mention patriotism. He mentions geometry, because geometry does not care what flag is stitched to your flight suit. Then he drops the sentence that stings like antiseptic. You're going to learn to stop turning when you feel like turning. That's the hardest part, really. Not the G-loads, not the fear of a missile, the urge, the instinct that says, if I'm in a fight, I must turn to face the threat. For years, pilots have been training their bodies to do exactly that. Now the instructor is asking them to unlearn it. He flips the slide. A simple list appears, short, brutal phrases, the kind that can survive in the mind when blood leaves the head. Don't follow it into the slow fight. Go vertical. Keep your speed. If you lose sight, you lose your life. He looks at them like a man who has already watched enough funerals. You're going to be embarrassed, he says. If you're doing this right, you'll be embarrassed every day for a week. Somebody forces a laugh. It dies immediately. Because you're not here to prove you're good, the instructor continues. You're here because good wasn't enough. He gestures toward the door. Let's meet your teacher. When they step outside, the desert hits them with dry heat and sunlight so bright it feels like it scrapes the eyes. The air smells like dust and fuel and something faintly metallic. Somewhere out on the runway, a small silver-shaped taxis with an arrogance that doesn't match its size. A MiG-21. The pilots stop walking without meaning to. Up close, it looks even smaller than they expected. Compact, purposeful, like a weapon that never had room for comfort. The rivets are there. The skin is imperfect. The jet looks practical. The kind of practical that doesn't need anyone's approval. A few men instinctively search for the trick. A canopy painted, a mock-up, a captured museum piece. Then the MiG turns slightly and the sunlight hits the intake and the cockpit and the insignia that has been quietly removed or covered, and it becomes undeniable. This isn't a story. This is a thing, and the thing is about to fly. The first training sortie is not cinematic the way movies imagine. It begins with procedures, checklists, and a kind of careful tension that feels like a hand around the throat. On the ramp, ground crew move with the efficiency of people who know mistakes don't just kill, they embarrass entire careers. The Americans have taped over Cyrillic labels inside the cockpit. The tape is ordinary, beige, almost comical. But that tape has a symbolic weight now. It's the thin paper line between unknown and known. The MiG's engine winds up again, and the jet rolls out, and the pilots assigned to fight it climb into their phantoms with the uneasy sensation that they are about to spar with something that has been haunting them in the dark. In the air, the first engagement begins the way doctrine says it should. The Phantom uses its radar, its power, its confidence. It comes in fast, a heavy beast that believes speed and technology will dictate terms. And then the MiG does what it has always done. It gets small. It disappears against the sky until the Phantom pilot is forced to admit, through clenched teeth, that he cannot see the threat the way he wants to see it. His radar is not a guarantee. His missile is not a promise. The merge becomes close and quick and personal. The Phantom tries to turn. It is a reflex, a moment of old training rising up, eager to prove itself. The MiG punishes that reflex immediately. It bites inside the turn circle, clinging close with that unsettling sense of being light and alive. The Phantom bleeds energy. The pilot feels the jet become heavier in his hands, like it's tired. He doesn't even have to be outflown. He just has to be tempted. The instructor's voice from the morning briefing returns in the Phantom pilot's mind, calm as a rule of law. Stop turning when you feel like turning. So he stops. He unloads the jet. He takes it vertical. He uses the Phantom's engines not to dance, but to climb. He drags the fight upward, away from the tight circles where the MiG thrives, into a place where the MiG's strength becomes a hunger problem. Fuel, time, patience. He doesn't chase the MiG's game. He changes the board. And suddenly the MiG doesn't look like a monster. It looks like a specialist. Brilliant, lethal, but specialized. A sprinter in a marathon. The MiG tries to follow. It has to. Pride and physics both demand it. It pitches up, and for a moment it still looks magnificent, small and sharp and defiant. Then its limitations begin to whisper. It can't linger in Afterburner without paying. It can't afford to waste time. It can't see everywhere at once. The Phantom pilot remembers the cone. Instead of chasing, he positions. He slides into the place behind the MiG where the MiG pilot would have to bank to see him. And banking would mean drag, and drag would mean losing the only currency that matters in a fight: energy. On the radio, the instructor says nothing encouraging. He doesn't cheer, he only corrects. "Stay there," he says. "Don't get greedy." The Phantom pilot feels something almost like relief, a strange lightness. Not because he's winning, but because the fight suddenly makes sense. It has rules that can be learned. That's the moment the training becomes more than training. Because once a pilot learns that the MiG can be understood, the MiG stops being mythic. And myth is half the enemy's weapon. They fly again, and again, and again. They fight the MiG-17 too, and the experience is humiliating in a different way. The MiG-17 doesn't need speed to hurt you. It needs you to make a single bad decision. Slow down, turn too hard, stay too long near the ground. It turns so tightly that the Phantom pilot feels like he's trying to swat a fly with a steel door. He swings, he misses, and suddenly the antique is behind him, lining up a cannon shot that exists only in the debrief, but is still in execution. Every sortie becomes a bruise on old doctrine. Every debrief becomes a new piece of scripture. They fill notebooks, they draw diagrams, they build little sayings that can survive in a pilot's mind when the world is shaking and the breathing is loud and the cockpit is a hot cage. They stop thinking in generalities: fast, agile, dangerous. They start thinking in specifics. If it's a MiG-17, don't gift it a slow fight. Go vertical and stay fast. If it's a MiG-21, don't panic and run in a straight line. Position into the blind cone. Force it to spend energy checking its 6. Knowledge becomes habit. Habit becomes confidence. Confidence becomes aggression. And aggression, in the hands of a trained pilot, changes the entire tone of a war. That is the real product of Groom Lake, not the plane itself. The plane is only the raw material. The product is what happens when the raw material is turned into a curriculum. Somewhere in a secure office, a report begins to take shape. Thick, technical, merciless. Pages of performance curves, limits, recommendations. Tactics written like surgical instructions. It's not glamorous, it's not poetic. It is an autopsy performed on a living legend. A book that doesn't simply describe how to defeat a MiG. A book that explains how to stop being afraid of it. And then, because war does not pause politely to let you finish writing, the knowledge moves out of the desert. It moves in quiet briefings, in instructor pilots who carry the lessons like scars, in exercises where young men feel the shock of being outturned by a museum piece, and learn, sweating and furious, that pride is not a strategy. It moves into the fleet, into the squadrons, into the air war that will resume with new intensity when diplomacy runs out of rope. Years later, over North Vietnam again, a Phantom pilot sees the silver dart of a MiG in the haze and doesn't feel the old dread. Not because the MiG is less dangerous, because it isn't, but because the MiG is no longer a mystery. The MiG turns for the trap. The Phantom doesn't take it. The MiG tries to lure him into the knife fight. The Phantom climbs and refuses. The MiG banks to search for the threat behind him, and in that bank, so small it would be invisible to anyone but another pilot, he pays the tax. The Phantom slides into the cone. The engagement ends the way it often ends when knowledge meets habit. Suddenly. Not with drama. With inevitability. On the ground, Soviet advisors watching radar plots begin to feel something that has no technical term. It's not just concern. It's not just anger. It's the sensation of being studied, like prey. Reports make their way back through channels built for bad news. Pilots complain that Americans are predicting them, that the enemy is waiting in the one place the MiG can't easily look, that the fight feels scripted. In Moscow, inside a design bureau that once felt invulnerable behind its secrecy, men begin to notice the pattern too. They receive fragments at first, rumors, murmurs, accusations. Then a report arrives that is too clean, too precise. It describes losses that don't sound like bad luck or heroic enemy improvisation. It sounds like someone used the MiG's own personality against it. A senior engineer reads a line, then reads it again. His office is quiet except for the faint rattle of a radiator and the distant sounds of a city that believes itself safe. He stares at the paper and feels an emotion that is almost childlike in its clarity. Violation. Not of airspace, of intimacy. Because the report implies something unbearable. The Americans aren't guessing. They're exploiting. They are operating right at the edge of stability, right at the line where the MiG starts to misbehave, as if they've sat in the cockpit and felt the warning through the stick. They are approaching from angles that match known blind spots, as if they have looked over their shoulder inside the canopy and seen what the MiG pilot cannot see. They are forcing maneuvers that reveal shortcuts, fuel behavior, control quirks, recovery time, shortcuts that were acceptable when nobody else knew them, shortcuts that become fatal when the enemy does. The engineer understands in one brutal moment that secrecy was never just protection, it was a dependency. And dependency is dangerous because it makes you brittle the moment your secret escapes. He looks around his office, the drafting tools, the charts, the half-built dreams of future aircraft, and he imagines, with a sick clarity, an American hangar where his jet is sitting under fluorescent lights, while strangers tape English words over his language. He imagines them drawing cones behind the cockpit on a whiteboard. He imagines them laughing, not at the rivets anymore, but at the fact that they can predict the MiG's desperation. He imagines a pilot somewhere saying, casually, "He can't see me here." And in that casualness is the true humiliation. Because the MiG was supposed to be terrifying. Now it is familiar. In the desert, the training continues. The MiGs fly until their airframes are tired, until the mystery is completely drained out of them. There is no reverence in the process, only hunger, only repetition. The pilots who graduate from this strange, unofficial school carry the lessons forward, and those lessons spread through the force like a new language. A language built from stolen metal, a language made of angles. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the Cold War quietly shifts a gear. Because once you learn how powerful it is to steal a machine and turn it into knowledge, you start looking at every enemy weapon not as a threat, but as a potential instructor. If one MiG can be turned into a book, then the next aircraft becomes an unanswered question hanging over the future like a storm. What about the next generation? What about the faster one? The higher one? The one no one has touched yet? That question doesn't need to be spoken aloud at Groom Lake. You can feel it in the way the hangar doors close, in the way men look at empty space and imagine it filled. And in the Soviet Union, the answer arrives as a different question, colder and more bitter. How do you build a weapon whose advantage cannot be stolen? How do you design around the fact that the enemy might one day sit in your cockpit? There is no clean solution to that. Only escalation, only more secrecy, more paranoia, more frantic redesigns meant to patch the holes that have already been weaponized. But patching a hole does not restore the original magic. Because the true magic was never in the rivets or the engine or the paint. It was in the fog, and the fog is gone. In the end, the image that remains isn't a dogfight explosion or a triumphant victory parade. It's something quieter and more unsettling. A strip of beige tape inside a turquoise cockpit, a handwritten English label covering a Cyrillic word, a small act of translation that becomes a strategic earthquake. The Soviets built thousands of fighters. The Americans needed only a handful, only enough to learn the shape of the fear, to measure it, to label it, to turn it into habit. The shock wasn't the airplane. The shock was the mirror. Because once you've seen the enemy up close, once you've touched him, flown him, broken him down into numbers, you can never be impressed by the myth again. And in war, when myth dies, something else takes its place. Cold, practical certainty.